It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This month, we continue our slow and inevitable march to the end of the line for the Universal Classic Monster cycle. This month, we have 4 more sequels yet to be covered from this monster giant, and it starts this week with 1942's Invisible Agent. So obviously, Invisible refers to the 1933 adaptation Universal did of H.G. Wells' classic sci-fi novel published in chapters within a magazine in 1897, The Invisible Man. Now, I do find it interesting that Wells was alive while Universal released all of their original run of Invisible Man movies. He did pass away by the time Universal made Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man in 1951. But let's think about this for a second. Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Invisible Man were 3 of the first 4 Universal Classic Monsters films. Sure, there are others that preceded those from Universal that are classics, and there were some one-off films that released in between these movies. And of course, those are, typically considered the original Universal Classic Monsters, along with 1932's The Mummy. So, with The Mummy, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, those were the ones that we think of in terms of the original first run of Universal Classic Monsters. But Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Invisible Man were the ones based on previously published material. Yes, The Mummy has a resemblance to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's short story, The Ring of Thoth, but that's not officially listed as being adapted from that story. But the point I'm trying to make is that Bram Stoker passed away nearly 20 years before the release of Dracula, and Mary Shelley was long dead as Universal's Frankenstein was released 80 years after her death. But H.G. Wells was still alive to see The Invisible Man get adapted by Universal and then sequelized again and again. Wells was involved closely with the production of the first film and got the opportunity to oversee and approve versions of the script. And it took some time for him to finally see a script that he approved of and even appreciated some of the changes made about the monocaine formula driving Griffin insane. But that said, he didn't often talk about the movie aside from the fact that he did appreciate that the movie's success drove more people to read the original work and kept that a popular book that would continuously sell. However, what we're here to talk about this week is the 1942 sequel, Invisible Agent. I do find this movie to be interesting in a couple of ways. First, it carries along the idea that each of the Invisible Man movies are slightly different. The original feels like a gothic cautionary tale of scientific triumph driving someone mad with power. The second film is basically a direct sequel, but feels a little bit more modern and a tale of redemption. The third was basically a comedy that borders on it being a rom-com. This one is a little bit more of a thrilling espionage caper. And the other thing that I did find interesting about this is that it is most definitely a product of its time. Now, understand this came out in July 1942, and it was actually in production in April and May of that same year. So yeah, the movie was finished in late May after a scant 5-week shoot. And then it hit screens 8 weeks later. But think about this. What was going on in the summer of 42? Well, aside from a one-sided love affair with an older woman, the world was at war. A war, I might add, that the United States had just joined 6 months prior. It has been noted by the film historian authors of Universal Horrors that with the states now involved in World War II, the cynicism of the 30s was replaced by the flag waving of the 40s. And what this would lead to would be this peculiar mix of horror and propaganda all in the same subject matter. Now, those same historians who wrote that history of the studio's monsters described that as being an uncomfortable hybrid. And this was a time in which evil scientists or villains who worked against our protagonists in horror films were also suddenly written to be either in league with or flat out Nazis as well. Now, Peter Lorre is in this film, and we'll have more opportunity to talk about Lorre later when we look at movies in which he plays a much bigger part. But suffice it to say, he was a pretty big star at this time. He made The Wonderfully Dark M by Fritz Lang, and was in the first version of Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much. He then came to the United States and appeared in a couple of pretty big Humphrey Bogart films right around the time that he appeared in this movie. The first was John Huston's The Maltese Falcon in 1941, and then 1942's Casablanca, one of the greatest films ever made. He is a representative of the Axis powers in this movie alongside Cedric Hardwicke, who appeared as Ludwig Frankenstein the same year as this movie came out in The Ghost of Frankenstein. And in 1936, Hardwicke also appeared in Things to Come, which was also based on a H.G. Wells book. Now, our main star of The Invisible Agent is John Hall, who was right at the beginning of his Universal contract, which would find him in several of their horror films and adventure pictures for years to come. Hall's character in this movie goes by Frank Raymond, but also that's kind of a... he's only called that at the very, very beginning of the movie because his actual name is Frank Griffin. And that's a nod to the Griffin who was the original Invisible Man and was added into the script by writer Kurt Siamak, who wanted to connect the film back to the original. Now, co-starring with him is the Hungarian actress Ilana Massey, who later would admit that she disliked this movie so much she forgot much about the movie's production. Now, both contemporary and retrospective reviews of this film are a slight bit more forgiving, even if the movie is often labeled to be kind of, uneven and sometimes poorly acted. However, generally, this movie was remembered to be a little bit better than some of the other patriotic B films that were being cranked out by studios at the same time. Several point to Hardwicke and Lorre as being a really strong part of this cast, and they could elevate this above the kind of silly dialogue that they were given to speak. Regardless, the movie did do well. It was made on a $322,000 budget and brought in over $1 million, so not too bad all said and done. Now, the movie opens with Conrad Stauffer and Baron Aikido, agents of the Axis powers, stopping into a print shop run by Frank Raymond, the assumed name of Frank Griffin Jr. Now, Stauffer is a lieutenant general of the SS, and he's played by Cedric Hardwicke, and Aikido is a Japanese man. Now, never mind that Peter Lorre is playing a Japanese guy. It's 1942. We just kind of have to let that slide. But Stauffer and Aikido are willing to pay any amount of money named by Frank to buy the original Invisible Man's formula for invisibility. Their only reason to believe Frank has the formula is that he took the assumed name and went to some effort to set up the print shop. Now, Frank kind of resists giving away his grandfather's drug secrets, but Stauffer has his guys rough up Frank while Aikido determines a good way to make this guy talk would be to use his machinery in the print shop to cut off fingers and limbs. The threat of losing his fingers convinces Frank to give up his family secret, but before he hands it over to the bad guys, he fights back and escapes with it. And when he goes to the American government to tell his tale, he also resists giving it to them as well. Now, this changes when the attack on Pearl Harbor happens, and he's kind of flushed with patriotism at this point, but his deal is that only he will use the drug to be an American agent to gather information behind enemy lines. So as Griffin is flown over German airspace, he injects himself with the formula and goes invisible. He parachutes into action just as he is starting to go invisible. And before landing, he has stripped off everything but his parachute. This confuses the German soldiers on the ground, and he slips them and meets with Arnold Schmidt, who is going to give Griffin some information. That information is to meet with the lovely Maria Sorensen. And his ultimate mission is to obtain a list of German and Japanese spies within the U.S., and this list is in the possession of Stauffer. Now, Maria is to have dinner that night with Stauffer's next in command, Heiser. Now, the dinner is ultimately ruined by a drunk Griffin who makes a mess of everything while he's invisible. An embarrassed Heiser storms off and puts Maria on house arrest. Now, this upsets Maria quite a bit because she's actually a competent agent, and she actually has been trained quite well by the Germans, even though she is a double agent for the Allies. And she's pretty upset that this guy just kind of showed up this night and has basically ruined something that she's been working for a year to basically gain the information and the training she needed from the SS. But using cold cream and a robe and a towel for his head, Griffin is able to reveal his true face to Maria, who finds him quite attractive. Now, when Heiser returns to the office, he's surprised to find Stauffer and Akito there. Now, Stauffer is looking over a report about a parachuter who could not be found. The only trace of this guy was his discarded clothes. Now, between that report that Heiser kind of blows off as incompetence, and the story that Heiser has to tell his supervisor about how his uniform is now suddenly covered in food, Stauffer is suddenly quite interested in whether or not his friend Frank Griffin is now here in Germany. So Stauffer goes to Maria's and wakes her up in the middle of the night, and he questions both her and Heiser about their relationship. And Stauffer has Heiser arrested for plotting behind his back. He then tells Maria that he's got some more work to do with the mission in America, of which Maria plays a big part. But this is all a trap. Now, Stauffer believes Griffin has contacted Maria and was in the room when he was there, and has basically lured Griffin to his office to look for this book that has all these names in it. Now, he's locked into Stauffer's office and confronted by the SS officer, and he offers Griffin a deal: the formula for the drug in exchange for Griffin's life. Using the heater in the room, Griffin is able to set a fire, and in the mayhem gets the list of agents on his way out the door. And he takes the list of agents to Schmidt to send a radio broadcast of this info to England. Now, the involvement of Griffin has revealed a deep distrust between Stauffer and Akito. Meanwhile, Griffin sneaks into Heiser's cell and learns about the attack plans on the United States. Basically, the Germans are going to send a bunch of planes over to bomb New York City, while the agents inside the country will work to disrupt American business and basically their manufacturing. Now, the attack will begin tonight. So Griffin hurries back to Schmidt's to reveal the plans, but Schmidt has been arrested by Stauffer because Griffin, kind of like an idiot, called Maria on a tapped phone line. So that basically has given enough information to the SS that the Schmidt guy is involved in some anti-German stuff, and Maria might be involved in that as well. And when he gets to Schmidt's, Maria is waiting for him, which causes Griffin to kind of think that she's been playing both sides. But in truth, it's all actually a trap set by the Japanese, who take them both to the Japanese embassy to be questioned by Akito. Now, Heiser, who was with Griffin after telling him about the attack on New York, calls Stauffer to tell him about Akito's involvement in capturing Maria and Griffin, in hopes that this will save not only his life, because he was going to be executed in prison, but also to save his career. Now, Griffin and Maria end up escaping when Stauffer arrives with additional agents at the Japanese embassy, and Stauffer and Akito fight, leading to Akito killing Stauffer, and then Akito commits seppuku for losing the list of agents that was originally property of Japan. Heiser takes command of Stauffer's men briefly and tries to stop Griffin and Maria from leaving the country, but Griffin is not able to call ahead when they get into the plane and take off, and to tell the British that they're going to be arriving in a German plane, because it's been brought up earlier in the movie that the invisibility drug's effects cause him to basically lose consciousness, and and they're barely able to escape being shot down by the British by way of parachuting out of the plane. Griffin wakes up in the hospital, learns that Maria is indeed an actual double agent and working for the Allies, and they decide to basically give a relationship a go, mostly because Griffin won't tell her how he regained his visibility, and, well, she's a spy, and she always likes to know these types of things, so she plans on finding out the information one way or another. Let's get to the three things that I like about Invisible Agent. First up, I think there is an interesting contrast to how the Nazis are portrayed in this movie. Okay, first of all, I have to say, again, that it is kind of silly that Peter Lorre is playing a Japanese man, but it's not terribly cartoonish, so I think it is a little bit easier to let pass. However, I love the juxtaposition of the Cedric Hardwicke played Gestapo officer Stauffer and the grunts on the ground actually fighting the war. And also his number two, Heiser. But Stauffer is a problem. I mean, he's cold and cruel, right? I mean, you expect that from an SS officer of high standing. When he goes to question Maria and arrest Heiser, he talks about how seeing friends arrested kind of helps harden a person. That's kind of part of Maria's training if she's going to be an agent as well. She's got to be able to accept seeing people that she's grown close to being arrested. And then, I mean, that also leads to Maria talking about how much she hates how Germans, particularly the SS, treat people, in particular how they treat women. Kind of a nice little scene there, but this is probably the best I've ever seen Hardwicke in the Universal movies he appeared in. However, the soldiers fighting the war are kind of doofuses. The three soldiers trying to find Griffin after he parachuted in all say the same thing, but in three different ways. One says, "Oh, I can't find him." The next says, "He's missing." And the third says, "He's gone." It's almost played comedically as the stooges we wanted to think the German grunts were in the war. And Heiser is kind of a weasel who tries to wine and dine Maria despite her possibly being romantically involved with Stauffer. But he's well out of his depths with the lovely Maria. I'd much more believe that she would be involved with Cedric Hardwicke than J. Edward Bromberg. But what do I know? But speaking of Bromberg, he was accused of being a communist in 1950, and he was subsequently blacklisted in Hollywood. Now, he did get some work in England after this, but the stress from this aged him terribly in just a very short period of time. And he actually died in 1951, just before his 48th birthday. But he is good as the Weasley Heiser. Next, I mentioned earlier that at times it seems a little uneven and uncomfortable to mix the horror/sci-fi element with what was the basis of the original Invisible Man stuff with the more patriotic anti-Nazi stuff. But there is a bunch of lighthearted fun stuff in the dinner scene with Maria and Heiser that I actually really liked. I mean, Griffin is playing around with his new invisibility, and he's also drunk. He makes Heiser think that he's kind of going crazy. He does that actually in two scenes. One during the dinner where he takes food off of his plate and hides it in Heiser's pocket. He lights Maria's lighter for her cigarette. He dumps the entirety of the table onto Heiser's lap. And then later in the jail cell, he kind of tortures Heiser. That one's not quite as lighthearted, but it's all the same idea that he's trying to break somebody he sees as being pretty, kind of pretty weaselly and pretty insignificant in terms of, hiding behind a tough man uniform. But the scene at Maria's is a fun little scene. And it does kind of call back to The Invisible Woman, which was a straight comedy. And it also kind of goes back to my first like, where the movie does want to thumb its nose at Nazis in general. And I can always go for that. Lastly, I actually kind of like this movie on the basic war movie suspense premise. This is not so much a monster or science fiction film. It's just a thriller that features threads that connect to the Invisible Man. However, the suspense element is actually kind of good. It's not the Invisible Man who is the monster, but the character of Stauffer. And oddly enough, I like how the monsters in this movie, which are the Axis powers, are basically eating themselves over this very uneasy alliance that they have. It was rather inspired casting of Peter Lorre and Cedric Hardwicke as the bad guys. And like I said earlier, Hardwicke is amazing in this. And Lorre reminds me a ton of the Ronald Lacey Major Todt character from Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's the espionage element that really drives this movie to be an entertaining as it is. And it's nowhere near the great World War II films, but for 80 minutes, it's pretty darn good entertainment, if you ask me. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, I've held this one off for as long as I could, despite really looking forward to taking another look at it. We're going to be checking out Lon Chaney Jr. as Count Alucard, the dreaded son of Dracula. Until next week, stay spooky.